3 weeks ago, I stood in my empty house, staring at the "For Sale" sign planted in my front yard. Moving boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, ready for my departure from what had been my home for over a decade. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional car passing by on Oak Street. What struck me most wasn't the emptiness of my own house, but the house across the street, the one that belonged to Barbara Karen Henderson, former HOA president of Sunset Gardens. Barbara had vanished from the neighborhood without a trace. No forwarding address, no goodbye, nothing. Her house sat abandoned, with a foreclosure notice taped to the front door like a scarlet letter. The HOA office had been closed indefinitely, and the neighbors who once rallied behind Karen's iron-fisted rule now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with me. My son Tommy, who had worked as a 911 dispatcher for 5 years, had suddenly quit his job around the same time Barbara disappeared. The strangest part wasn't Barbara's disappearance itself. It was how quickly the entire neighborhood had unraveled without her presence. What had started as a simple dispute over a fence height had somehow escalated into something that destroyed careers, broke families, and left an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right. The answer to how we got here lies in the most bizarre 911 call my son ever received. A call where the person reporting the crime had no idea she was confessing to the very dispatcher whose father she was trying to frame. 2 months before everything fell apart, I was enjoying a peaceful Saturday afternoon in my backyard, watering the tomato plants I'd carefully tended all summer. At 52, I'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments, especially after spending 25 years as a federal compliance inspector, a job that taught me more about human nature and corruption than I ever wanted to know. Retirement had been good to me, giving me time to focus on simple pleasures like gardening and spending time with my 35-year-old son Tommy, who still lived with me while saving up for his own place. That's when I heard the familiar click-clack of heels on concrete and turned to see Barbara Henderson marching across my lawn like she owned it. She was dressed in her usual HOA uniform, a bright red polo shirt with the Sunset Gardens logo emblazoned across the chest, paired with white shorts that were just a little too tight for someone in their mid-40s. In her hands, she carried a clipboard and a measuring tape, which in Barbara's world were weapons of mass destruction. "Mr. Miller," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries, "I've received multiple complaints about your fence being in violation of community standards." She gestured dramatically toward my 6-foot privacy fence, the same fence that had stood there for 8 years without a single issue. According to my measurements, it exceeds the height limit by exactly 2 inches. I watched as she held up her tape measure at an angle that would make any surveyor cringe, clearly measuring from the lowest point of my yard, to make the fence appear taller than it actually was. "Mrs. Henderson," I replied calmly, setting down my watering can, "I'd be happy to discuss this, but I believe you're measuring incorrectly. The fence was approved when I installed it, and nothing has changed since then." Her face flushed red, matching her polo shirt perfectly. "Mr. Miller, I don't need lessons on how to do my job. I am the authority here. You elderly residents seem to think age gives you the right to ignore community standards, but I'm here to remind you that rules apply to everyone." The word elderly hung in the air like a slap. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, but the familiar feeling I used to get when I discovered someone abusing their position of power. "I see," I said quietly, making a mental note of every detail. The improper measuring technique, the lack of witnesses, the failure to provide written notice as required by HOA bylaws. "Well, Mrs. Henderson, I'll certainly look into this matter more thoroughly." She smiled triumphantly, apparently missing the subtle warning in my tone. "Good. You have 72 hours to bring the fence into compliance, or you'll be facing fines." As she strutted back toward her house, clipboard held high like a victory banner, she had no idea she'd just awakened something that had been sleeping peacefully for 2 years. In my previous career, I'd taken down corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. Barbara Henderson was about to learn that retirement hadn't dulled my skills. It had only given me more time to use them. The fateful Saturday started like any other weekend. Tommy and I had planned a trip to the hardware store and grocery shopping, intending to be gone for most of the afternoon. At 1 o'clock, we loaded into my truck and headed out, discussing his work as a 911 dispatcher and the crazy calls he'd been getting lately. "You wouldn't believe some of the stuff people call about Dad." He laughed, shaking his head. "Last week, someone called because their neighbor's wind chimes were too loud." What we didn't know was that Barbara had been watching our house from her living room window, timing our comings and goings like she was conducting surveillance. She'd been doing this for weeks, not just to my house, but to several others in the neighborhood. In her twisted mind, she'd convinced herself that her role as president gave her the right, no, the duty, to conduct inspections of residents' homes when they were away. At exactly 2:15, Barbara emerged from her house dressed in full HOA regalia, carrying what she called her master key, a key she claimed could open any door in the neighborhood for emergency purposes. The truth was, Barbara had somehow obtained or copied keys from previous homeowners, contractors, or real estate agents over the years, building her own personal collection of neighborhood access. She'd used these keys at least 7 or 8 times in the past few months, letting herself into homes to look for violations that she could use to assert her authority. Standing at my front door, Barbara inserted her key with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. But instead of the satisfying click of a lock opening, she heard nothing. She tried again, jiggling the key, turning it both ways, even examining the lock itself. Unknown to her, I'd upgraded to a smart lock system just 2 weeks earlier, partly for security, and partly because I'd suspected someone might be entering my home based on small things that seemed out of place when Tommy and I returned from errands. For 10 long minutes, Barbara struggled with that key, her confidence slowly morphing into frustration, then into full-blown rage. In her mind, this wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a personal attack on her authority. Someone had dared to change their locks without her permission, without consulting the HOA, without acknowledging her supreme right to access any property in her domain. The audacity was unbearable. That's when Barbara made the decision that would ultimately destroy her. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. "Hello, this is Barbara Henderson, president of the Sunset Gardens Homeowners Association," she announced with the imperious tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to report a break-in at 1247 Oak Street. Someone has changed the locks illegally, and I suspect there's been criminal activity." On the other end of the line, my son Tommy was just settling into his afternoon shift at the dispatcher's desk. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson. This is dispatcher Tommy Miller. Can you confirm that you're the homeowner at that address?" The question was routine, part of standard protocol, but Tommy hadn't yet connected the dots between the address and his own home. "No, I'm not the homeowner," Barbara replied impatiently. "But I have legitimate access rights as HOA president. My master key isn't working, which means someone has tampered with the locks. This is clearly a case of illegal modification of property." Tommy's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. 1247 Oak Street was his address. This woman was calling to report a break-in at his own house, and she was admitting to trying to enter it without permission. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy said carefully, his training taking over even as his personal emotions churned. "Let me make sure I understand correctly. You're calling to report that you cannot access a home that you don't own, using a key that the homeowner didn't provide to you." There was a pause on the line, and Tommy could almost hear the gears turning in Barbara's head as she began to realize the implications of what she'd just admitted. "Now wait just a minute," Barbara stammered. "You don't understand the authority that comes with being HOA president. I have the right to inspect properties for compliance issues." Tommy was now fully recording the call, as was standard procedure, but this recording would become something far more significant than a routine emergency report. "Mrs. Henderson, can you please state your full name and confirm the address where you're currently located?" At that moment, Tommy and I pulled into our driveway, returning earlier than expected from our shopping trip. I immediately noticed Barbara standing at my front door with her phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly as she spoke. Tommy saw her too, and his face went pale as he realized he was looking at the same woman he was speaking to through his dispatcher headset. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy said into his radio, stepping out of the truck while maintaining his professional demeanor. "I can see you're at 1247 Oak Street. I'm also looking at the homeowner who has just arrived. Would you like to explain to him why you're trying to enter his property without permission?" Barbara's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Confusion, recognition, horror, and finally desperate anger as she realized she'd been caught in the most humiliating way possible. As I stood in my driveway watching Barbara fumble with her phone, I realized this was the opportunity I'd been unknowingly waiting for. My 25 years as a federal compliance inspector had taught me that the most effective way to expose corruption wasn't through confrontation, but by letting corrupt people expose themselves. Barbara was doing exactly that, and I wasn't about to interrupt her self-destruction. "Tommy," I said quietly, "stay in your role as dispatcher. Handle this exactly as you would any other call." I could see the internal struggle on my son's face, torn between his professional duties and his personal involvement, but his training won out. He nodded and continued speaking into his radio with the same calm, professional tone he used for every emergency call. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy's voice came through clearly. "The homeowner is present now. Do you have his permission to be on his property?" Barbara's eyes darted between Tommy, me, and her phone, clearly trying to process how her simple break-in report had suddenly become a three-way conversation involving the very people she'd been trying to implicate. This is highly irregular," Barbara sputtered into her phone. "I don't need permission to perform HOA duties. I have authority under the community guidelines." But even as she spoke, I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. The absolute confidence she'd displayed for months was beginning to crack under the weight of an unexpected situation. "Ma'am," Tommy responded, "I need to inform you that what you're describing, entering someone's property without their consent using unauthorized keys, constitutes criminal trespass under state law. Are you admitting to this dispatcher that you've done this at other properties in your neighborhood?" It was a masterful question, delivered with professional neutrality, but designed to elicit exactly the kind of response that would seal Barbara's fate. And Barbara, true to form, couldn't resist defending her actions. "Of course I have. I've inspected 7 or 8 properties in the past month alone. It's my responsibility as HOA president to ensure compliance with community standards. How else am I supposed to verify that residents aren't violating regulations inside their homes? The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy continued recording. I stood watching, and Barbara seemed to finally realize that she'd just confessed to multiple counts of criminal trespass to a 911 dispatcher whose conversation was being officially recorded and could be used as evidence in court. Just then, Mrs. Williams from next door appeared on her front porch, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Miller," she called out. "Is everything all right? I saw Mrs. Henderson at your door earlier when you weren't home." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "She did the same thing at my house last Tuesday. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to cause trouble." Mr. Jackson from across the street had also emerged, apparently having witnessed the scene. "I've got it all on video," he announced, holding up his phone. "I thought she was a burglar at first, so I started recording when I saw her trying to break in." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Barbara's own neighbors, the very people she claimed to be protecting, had been documenting her illegal activities without even realizing it. Barbara's face had gone from red to white to an alarming shade of purple. "You people don't understand," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I'm trying to protect the property values of this neighborhood. Someone has to maintain standards. If I don't do it, who will?" But her words sounded hollow now, desperate justifications from someone who knew she'd been caught. Tommy, still maintaining his professional composure, made the call that would officially seal the case. "Mrs. Henderson, based on your statements during this recorded call, I'm required to dispatch officers to take a formal report regarding allegations of criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent, and I advise you to consider that carefully before making any additional statements." As we waited for the patrol cars to arrive, I found myself almost feeling sorry for Barbara, not because she didn't deserve what was coming, but because she genuinely seemed to believe that her position as HOA president gave her unlimited power over other people's lives. She'd become so intoxicated by the small amount of authority she wielded that she'd lost all sense of legal and ethical boundaries. In 15 minutes, a simple attempt to frame me for changing my own locks had turned into a recorded confession of multiple felonies, witnessed by neighbors and documented by surveillance footage. The patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes, and what followed was like watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse in slow motion. Officer Martinez, a veteran cop who'd clearly dealt with his share of neighborhood disputes, listened patiently as Tommy played back portions of the recorded 911 call. Barbara tried repeatedly to interrupt, to explain, to justify her actions, but each attempt only made things worse. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said with the weary patience of someone who'd seen it all, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. You called 911 to report a break-in at a house you don't own because a key you shouldn't have didn't work in a lock you had no right to use?" When he put it that way, even Barbara seemed to realize how ridiculous her situation had become. But the real reckoning came 2 weeks later, at the emergency HOA meeting that had been hastily called to address what everyone was now calling the Henderson incident. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. This wasn't just about Barbara anymore. It was about everything she represented. Every petty power grab, every arbitrary fine, every time someone had felt bullied or intimidated by the person they'd trusted to serve their community. I arrived with a folder containing everything I'd discovered during my investigation, copies of the 911 recording that had been released as public record, documentation of Barbara's financial irregularities as HOA president, testimony from 7 different neighbors about unauthorized entries into their homes, and most damning of all, evidence that Barbara had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including landscaping for her own property. Mrs. Williams spoke first, her voice shaking with emotion. I want everyone to know that Mrs. Henderson entered my home without permission 3 times over the past 2 months. I found evidence that someone had been in my house. Small things moved, drawers that weren't quite closed the way I'd left them. When I mentioned it to her, she said it was routine HOA business, and I should be grateful she was looking out for the neighborhood security. Mr. Jackson stood up next, his phone in hand. I've got video footage of Mrs. Henderson attempting to enter 4 different houses on our street over the past 6 weeks. I thought she was a burglar, but then I realized she was doing it in broad daylight, in her HOA shirt, like she had every right to be there. The room erupted in angry murmurs as people began to realize the scope of Barbara's violations. But it was elderly Mrs. Patterson who delivered the most devastating testimony. At 78 years old, she spoke with the clarity and authority of someone who'd lived through enough to recognize a bully when she saw one. Mrs. Henderson didn't just violate our privacy, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. She violated our trust. We elected her to serve this community, not to terrorize it. I've been afraid to leave my house for weeks, wondering if she'd be waiting inside when I got home. When Barbara finally stood to defend herself, the room fell silent with the kind of uncomfortable quiet that precedes a public humiliation. You people just don't understand the responsibilities of leadership, she began, but her voice lacked the commanding presence she'd once wielded so effectively. Every decision I made was for the good of this community. Property values, safety standards, maintaining the character of our neighborhood. Someone has to make the hard choices. The hard choice to steal $15,000 from the community fund? Mrs. Williams interrupted, having found her courage. The hard choice to make copies of our house keys without our knowledge? The hard choice to fine people for violations that don't exist in our actual HOA covenants? The questions came rapid fire now, from voices throughout the room, as residents who'd been intimidated into silence for months finally found their collective voice. Barbara's final attempt at maintaining control was both pathetic and revealing. "Fine!" she shouted, slamming her hand on the podium. "You want to know the truth? Yes, I went into your houses. Yes, I used community funds for legitimate expenses that benefited everyone. Yes, I enforced standards that some of you were too lazy or too cheap to follow voluntarily. And you know what? This neighborhood was better because of it. Property values were up, everything looked perfect, and people respected the rules. Now look what you've done. You've destroyed everything I built because you couldn't handle having a real leader." The vote to remove Barbara from her position was 47-3, with the 3 dissenting votes coming from her closest allies, who were too embarrassed to change their positions publicly. But the real victory wasn't the vote. It was watching Barbara finally understand that her reign of petty tyranny was over, that the community she'd terrorized had found its voice, and that all her justifications couldn't erase the simple fact that she'd abused the trust placed in her. 3 weeks after Barbara's removal from office, I stood in my kitchen making coffee and watching my son Tommy stare blankly at his laptop screen. He'd submitted his resignation from the dispatcher's office the day after the HOA meeting, and despite my attempts to convince him otherwise, he seemed determined to leave the job he'd loved for 5 years. "Dad," he said, without looking up from his screen. "I keep thinking about that phone call. Every time I close my eyes, I hear her voice admitting to all those break-ins, and I remember that I was the one who had to take that confession. It doesn't feel like justice anymore. It feels like I betrayed my professional ethics by being personally involved in a case." I understood his struggle better than he knew. During my years as a compliance inspector, I'd learned that victory against corruption always came with a price, and sometimes that price was paid by the people you cared about most. "Tommy," I said, sitting down across from him, "you handled that call exactly the way you were trained to handle it. You didn't seek out that situation. It came to you, and you dealt with it professionally." But even as I spoke the words, I could see they weren't providing the comfort he needed. The truth was, our victory over Barbara Henderson had cost us something precious: my son's peace of mind and his confidence in the profession he'd chosen. He'd been forced to choose between his duty as a dispatcher and his loyalty as a son, and even though he'd made the right choice, the conflict had left its mark. The neighborhood itself had changed in ways none of us had anticipated. Without Barbara's iron-fisted control, some residents seemed lost, unsure how to maintain community standards without someone telling them exactly what to do. Others had swung too far in the opposite direction, abandoning all pretense of neighborhood cooperation out of resentment for the way they'd been treated. The perfectly manicured lawns and meticulously maintained facades that had defined Sunset Gardens were beginning to show signs of neglect, not because people didn't care, but because they were still figuring out how to care without fear. Mrs. Williams stopped by one afternoon with news that hit me like a physical blow. "Mr. Miller," she said, wringing her hands nervously, "I thought you should know that Mrs. Henderson didn't just disappear. She moved to Riverside Estates, about 20 miles north of here. I heard from my cousin who lives there that she's already been elected to their HOA board. She's telling people that her previous neighborhood falsely accused her of misconduct because they were jealous of her effective leadership." The realization that Barbara was already rebuilding her empire of petty tyranny somewhere else made me question everything we'd accomplished. Had we really solved anything, or had we simply moved the problem to a different group of victims? The thought that she was out there right now, potentially making copies of keys and planning inspections of homes where families felt safe and secure, made my stomach turn. A month later, I made the decision that surprised everyone, including myself. When the interim HOA board approached me about taking over as president, citing my investigative skills and leadership during the Henderson crisis, I turned them down flat. I didn't fight Barbara Henderson to become Barbara Henderson, I told them. Power corrupts, and I've seen what it did to her. I've seen what it could do to anyone. Instead, I did something that felt both like victory and defeat. I put my house on the market, not because I was running away from the situation, but because I'd realized that staying in Sunset Gardens would mean living forever in the shadow of what had happened. Every day, I'd be reminded of the choice I'd made to expose Barbara, the price my son had paid for my decision, and the nagging question of whether justice had really been served or just relocated. Tommy found a new job as a legal aid for a non-profit organization that helps homeowners associations draft fair and transparent bylaws. At least this way, he told me with a sad smile, I can try to prevent other Barbara Hendersons from happening. It was meaningful work, but I could see that something had changed in him. A loss of innocence, maybe, or trust in the systems he'd once believed in completely. On my last day in the house, I sat on the front porch where this whole saga had begun, looking at the fence that had started it all. The fence was still exactly 6 feet tall, still perfectly legal, still serving its intended purpose of providing privacy and security. But it had become something more than wood and nails. It had become a symbol of the line between reasonable authority and authoritarian overreach, between community cooperation and individual freedom. As I locked the door one final time, I couldn't help but wonder, in a world full of Barbara Hendersons, people who abuse small amounts of power because they can, what's the real solution? Is it to fight them one by one, knowing that victory might cost you the very relationships you're trying to protect? Or is it to find a way to build communities where such people never gain power in the first place? I don't have those answers. What I do know is that sometimes winning feels a lot like losing, and sometimes the people who pay the highest price for justice are the ones who were just trying to do the right thing. 3 months later, I heard that Sunset Gardens had dissolved its HOA entirely, unable to find anyone willing to take on the responsibilities without the absolute power that had corrupted Barbara. Maybe that was the real victory after all, not replacing one flawed leader with another, but recognizing that some kinds of power are too dangerous to exist at all. The moving truck pulled away, and I drove past Barbara's old house one last time. The foreclosure sign was gone, replaced by a "sold" banner that fluttered in the afternoon breeze. I wondered who would move in, whether they'd know the history of the place, whether they'd be better neighbors than the woman who'd lived there before. But mostly, I hoped they'd be the kind of people who understood that being part of a community means looking out for each other, not looking into each other's homes when no one's watching. Justice, I'd learned, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure the punishment teaches the right lesson to the right people. And sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when to walk away.